The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her. It was the night of the midwinter feast in the heart of the Red Tooth Keep. The banquet hall was a cavern of noise and oppressive heat, illuminated by the burning gold of a dozen massive hearths. The air was thick, heavily layered with the scent of roasted venison, spiced winter wine, and the underlying, primal musk of 300 werewolves gathered to witness the elevation of their Luna. Saren Voss stood at the raised dais, dressed in a gown of spun silver and pale silk, her hands clasped loosely before her. The fabric whispered against the rough-hewn stone floor with every slight shift of her weight. She had waited 5 years for this night, 5 years of silent endurance, of proving her worth to a pack that viewed her lack of shifting ability as a divine curse. Tonight was supposed to be her triumph. Instead, it became the moment her entire world shattered. Julian Sterling, the Alpha King of the Northern Werewolf clan, stood beside her. But he was not looking at her. His broad shoulders, draped in a heavy cloak of black direwolf fur, were turned slightly away. His storm-grey eyes, usually alight with a fierce, possessive warmth when they rested upon her, were cold. They were hard like winter iron, locked on a figure approaching the steps of the dais. Melissa Vance moved with the calculated grace of a predator disguised as prey. She wore a gown that mirrored Saren's, though the cut was sharper, the neckline lower, the silk a bright, piercing white that seemed to mock the muted silver of the true bride's dress. The mistress smelled of poisoned honey and night-blooming jasmine, a cloying, artificial scent that cut through the wood smoke and roasted meat, coating the back of Saren's throat with an undeniable sickness. Something was wrong. Saren's inner wolf, a quiet, ancient thing that had never taken physical form, began to pace frantically within the cage of her ribs. The beast whined, a low, instinctual sound of impending doom. Julian raised a hand. The raucous laughter, the scraping of wooden benches, and the clattering of iron goblets died instantly. The silence that fell over the banquet hall was absolute, deafening in its sudden, heavy weight. Saren gazed at the man she was fated to love. She noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the arrogant lift of his chin. For 5 generations, this Lycan pack has been led by strength, Julian began, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that echoed off the vaulted stone ceiling. Our enemies multiply at the borders. The Ashlands grow restless. We cannot afford weakness upon the high seat. He turned to Saren. The physical distance between them was mere inches, but the chasm opening in his gaze was infinite. Saren, the Alpha King said, his tone devoid of any affection, stripped to a clinical, brutal edge. You were blessed by the moon as my fated, but the moon is sometimes blind to the realities of war. You have no wolf. You have no shifting power. You cannot defend the pack, let alone yourself. The words struck her like physical blows. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a collective intake of breath, followed by the cruel, eager whispers of the pack elders seated in the front rows. I, Julian Sterling, reject you as my mate and Luna. The tearing began immediately. It was not a metaphor, the sacred thread woven between their souls, a tether of golden light and primal magic, pulled taut across the expanse of her chest. Then it snapped. The physical agony of the severed bond exploded in Saren's ribcage, like a shattered bone piercing her lungs. Her skin flushed with a sudden, burning fever, only to plummet instantly into a freezing, paralyzing cold. Her vision swam with spidery patterns of ice, the edges of the hall blurring into grey static. Beneath her skin, her inner wolf let out a silent, soul-shredding howl. The beast collapsed onto the floor of her subconscious mind, bleeding, thrashing, and finally curling into a tight, shivering ball of absolute grief. She could not breathe. She could not think. But she did not fall. Saren locked her knees. She forced her spine to remain perfectly straight, an unbending pillar of quiet defiance. She dug her fingernails into the soft flesh of her palms, welcoming the sharp, grounding sting of her own crescent-shaped cuts. She would not let them see her bleed. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. Julian extended his hand, palm up, his expression unreadable. The crest, return it. The silver moon crest, an ancient, heavy signet ring of pure, unblemished silver, passed down through generations of the pack's lunars. Saren had worn it on a heavy chain around her neck for 3 years, a symbol of a promise that had just been burned to ash. Her fingers, trembling only slightly, reached for the clasp at the nape of her neck. The metal was warm from her skin. It felt like a living thing, heavy with memories of whispered promises in the dark, of Julian swearing he would protect her from the scorn of his court. Lies, all of it. She unfastened the chain. She did not hand it to him. Instead, she let it drop onto the scarred oak of the high table. The clatter of the heavy silver against the wood rang out like a gunshot. Julian's jaw tightened at the slight, but he picked up the crest. He turned to Melissa, who was standing with her head bowed in a perfect portrait of humble obedience. But as the king slid the silver chain over her neck, the mistress's eyes flicked to Saren. A smile. A cold, victorious, razor-thin smile meant only for Saren's eyes. Melissa Vance has proven her strength, her fertility and her loyalty to this pack, Julian announced, his voice rising to fill the cavernous space. She shall take the seat of Luna. And as for you, you are banished from this territory. You will walk into the outer wastes, and you will not return. A death sentence. The outer wastes were a freezing, lethal wasteland bordering the great ashlands, a place where the cold froze the marrow in your bones, and the dormant volcanic magic suffocated the lungs. The entire court waited. They waited for the weeping. They waited for the broken Omega to throw herself at the Alpha King's boots, to beg for a place as a servant, to plead for her life. She studied the man who had held her in the dark, who had traced the line of her jaw and called her his sanctuary. He was a stranger, a small, cruel man hiding behind a crown of iron and fur. She lifted her chin. Her silver-grey eyes, dry and clear as a winter sky, met his storm-grey gaze. I accept. 2 words, spoken quietly, yet they carried a strange, resonant weight that seemed to vibrate through the stone floor. Julian flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a sudden tightening of his shoulders, a flash of something that looked dangerously like panic in his eyes. He had expected resistance. He had expected her to fight, to validate his decision by showing weakness. Instead, she gave him nothing. Saren turned away from the dais. She did not look back. She walked down the long, narrow aisle of the hall. The crowd parted for her, stepping back as if her lack of shifting power was a contagion. The heat of the roaring fires felt oppressive now, a suffocating weight pressing down on her shoulders. The silence was broken only by the soft rustle of her silver silk dress and the steady, rhythmic click of her low boots against the stone. As she neared the heavy oak doors that led to the courtyard, a figure stepped into her path. Calen Mercer, the eldest of the pack advisors, a man whose skin was mapped with deep, leathery wrinkles, and whose amber eyes held the cruel, glinting light of a predator playing with a wounded mouse. He leaned heavily on his gnarled wooden staff, deliberately blocking the exit. The heavy woolen robes he wore rustled as he shifted his weight. A tragic loss for the pack, the elder sneered, his voice a raspy whisper designed to carry just far enough for the nearby guards to hear. But what is a king to do with a mute, useless wolf? You should be grateful the Alpha let you walk away, girl. Though, given the winter bite outside, a quick snap of the neck would have been a kinder mercy. Saren stopped. She stared at the old man. She noted the scent of decaying mint and stale wine on his breath. She noted the way his knuckles gripped the staff, white and strained, betraying a deep, underlying cowardice. She did not speak. She simply stared at him with those unsettling, storm-pale eyes, her expression a mask of pure, frozen calm. Under the weight of her absolute silence, Calen's smug smile faltered. He shifted his weight, clearing his throat nervously before stepping aside. Saren walked past him. She pushed the heavy iron latch of the great doors. They swung open, and the winter night swallowed her. The contrast was violent. The air outside the keep was a physical assault, a blast of freezing wind that cut through the thin silver silk of her gown like 1,000 icy blades. The sky above was a canvas of deep, bruised purple, devoid of stars. The scent of pine and wood smoke from the village below was quickly overpowered by the harsh, metallic bite of impending snow. She descended the stone steps of the keep, her boots finding traction on the frost-slicked stones. Her body began to fail her almost immediately. The severance of the mate bond was a systemic shock, a poison working its way through her bloodstream. Her heart beat in an erratic, painful rhythm. Her inner wolf lay dormant, a silent weight in the cavern of her soul. Every breath she took felt like inhaling crushed glass. But she kept moving. Down through the sleeping village, past the warm, glowing windows of cottages where families sat safely by their hearths. No one came out to stop her. No one offered her a cloak. She was an exile, a ghost already haunting the edges of their reality. She reached the border of Julian's territory just before dawn. The tree line thinned, the ancient, snow-heavy pines giving way to a stark, terrifying landscape, the outer wastes. Here the snow did not fall clean. It mixed with the constant drifting ash carried on the wind from the great ashlands to the east. The ground beneath her boots changed from frozen earth to jagged, blackened volcanic rock. The temperature plummeted further, yet beneath the freezing wind, there was a strange, unnatural heat radiating from deep within the earth, smelling of sulfur and ancient burning iron. Saren walked through the freezing ashlands for 2 agonizing days and nights. Her journey was a haze of physical deterioration and sheer, unyielding stubbornness. On the first day, the adrenaline faded, leaving her completely exposed to the lethal elements. Without the ambient warmth of a pack bond to regulate her internal temperature, the winter cold sank directly into her bones. Her joints ached with a dull, grinding pressure. The silver silk of her gown offered no protection. It had stiffened into a frozen shell, slicing microscopic cuts into her frostbitten skin with every step. By the first night, the temperature dropped so rapidly that her breath formed solid crystals in the air. She found shallow refuge beneath an overhang of black volcanic rock, curling her shaking body into a tight ball. Her inner wolf remained dormant, a silent, bleeding weight in the hollow of her chest. The pain of the severed bond was a systemic shock, a poison that caused her heart to beat in an erratic, agonizing rhythm. Every inhalation scraped against her throat like dry sand. She did not sleep. She merely survived the dark, listening to the distant, haunting howls of Julian's border patrols echoing off the icy crags. The second day was worse. Hunger clawed at her empty stomach, but it was the thirst that truly tormented her. The only moisture came from the toxic, ash-laden snow, which she forced herself to melt in her raw, bleeding palms before swallowing. It tasted of sulfur and decay. She stumbled repeatedly, her knees striking the sharp ridges of black stone, tearing the silk of her dress and biting into her skin. Warm blood trickled down her shins, a stark, vivid red against the grey landscape, freezing almost instantly against her pale flesh. Her breathing grew shallow, a ragged hiss of air through chapped, broken lips. On the second night, violent tremors racked her slim frame as hypothermia began to war with the fever of the broken bond. She lay on the frozen ground, staring up at a sky devoid of stars, obscured by the endless drift of grey ash. The urge to simply close her eyes, to let the freezing ash cover her and drift into a quiet, painless sleep, was overwhelming. It would be so easy to be forgotten, to vanish like smoke through a crack in the world. Then a thought echoed in the empty cavern of her mind. We are small things in a world of teeth. It was something her mother had told her, long before she died, long before Julian had promised to be her shield. It was a warning. The world was designed to consume the weak. If you lay down, the teeth would find you. Saren opened her eyes. She forced herself up, her raw, scraped hands pushing against the volcanic rock. She wrapped her arms around her shivering torso and looked toward the eastern horizon. By midday of the third day, the winter sun hung like a pale, frozen coin in the ash-choked sky. Saren's body was failing, moving entirely on the dying embers of her willpower. Her bare arms were completely numb, the frost creeping up her fingers, turning her skin a ghostly blue. The ash coated her dark hair, turning it grey, making her look like a spectre wandering through purgatory. In the distance, behind her, she could hear the faint, echoing sound of wolf howls. Julian's border patrols, they were watching her, ensuring she did not turn back, forcing her to march obediently to her execution by the elements or the gate. She ignored them. She focused entirely on the geometry of the ground ahead of her. A sharp rock, a pool of freezing sulphurous water, a patch of slick black ice. Then she saw it, looming in the deep gloom of the midday haze, the great Dragon Gate. It was a myth made manifest, a colossal, soot-blackened barrier of ancient iron and dormant volcanic stone that stretched across a narrow pass between two impassable mountain peaks. It was said to have been sealed centuries ago, locking away the forgotten empire of the Dragon Clan. Thick columns of toxic smoke rose from the deep fissures at its base, carrying the lethal heat of the Earth's core. The stories claimed that any creature without the royal blood of the old winged kings who dared touch the gate would be instantly incinerated, reduced to a pile of white ash on the frozen rocks. Thousands of exiled werewolves, rogue vampires, and desperate travelers had perished against its burning iron over the centuries. It was a place of death. Saren stared at the massive iron structure, the faint, glowing veins of molten gold tracing through the black stone pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm like the heartbeat of a sleeping god. She had nowhere else to go. Behind her was a pack that had laughed at her disposal, a king who had traded her for a fragile lie and a life she could no longer return to. Ahead of her was a wall of lethal fire. She began to walk. The heat of the colossal barrier grew stronger as she approached, a suffocating, dry radiation that pushed back the winter cold. It felt heavy, ancient, and deeply terrifying. The smoke stung her eyes, forcing tears to finally fall, though they were tears of physical irritation, not of sorrow. She had promised herself she would not cry for the man who broke her, and she would keep that promise even as she walked to her death. The massive iron doors towered above her now, ascending into the dark ash-choked sky. The metal was blisteringly hot, radiating a deep, angry red glow from the center seam. The ground surrounding the gate was littered with the scorched, brittle bones of those who had come before her, skulls half buried in the black sand, rib cages shattered by the sheer force of the defensive magic. Saren stood at the edge of the ash field, 20 paces from the gate. The heat was unbearable. It dried the blood on her knee and blistered the exposed skin of her face. Her inner wolf, previously catatonic, suddenly stirred. It did not whimper in fear. It lifted its head, sniffing the heavy, sulphurous air with a strange, primal curiosity. She took a breath, the hot air burning her lungs. She took the final steps forward. The final 20 paces were a descent into a furnace. The ambient temperature around the ancient iron doors was so intense that the remaining moisture in Saren Voss's torn silver dress evaporated into thin, hissing steam. The frost that had armored her skin for 2 days melted violently, leaving her exposed flesh raw, agonizingly sensitive to the biting, sulphur-laden wind. Each breath she dragged into her damaged lungs tasted of scorched iron and ancient decay. The ground beneath her boots shifted from sharp volcanic rock to a dense, unstable layer of pulverized white bone. Compacted ash, the remains of 1,000 fools. She did not stop. Behind her carried on the freezing drafts of the outer wastes. The distant howls of Julian's border patrols echoed against the jagged mountain peaks. Julian's trackers, They were waiting. They were watching from the safety of the distant tree line, eager to see the supposedly useless Mute Omega incinerated against the legendary barrier. They wanted a spectacle of her demise to validate their former Alpha King's cruel judgment. They wanted her to scream. She would give them nothing, no tears, no begging, only silence. The colossal structure loomed over her, an architectural nightmare of black steel and dormant magma. The twin doors were easily 30 feet high, forged from a metal that seemed to absorb the pale winter light and reflect only a sinister, bleeding red. Intricate, overlapping scales were carved into the iron. They formed the spiraling bodies of massive serpents that intertwined at the center seam. The seam itself was a vertical river of blinding, volatile heat. It crackled with a violent, defensive magic that had stood unbroken for centuries. Saren stopped inches from the barrier. The heat radiating from the metal was absolute. It was a physical wall pressing against her chest, heavy enough to crush the breath from her throat. Her eyelashes curled and singed at the tips. The crescent-shaped cuts in her palms, self-inflicted during her public humiliation when Julian had crowned Melissa Vance, began to bleed anew. Her skin tightened and cracked under the sheer thermal pressure. The pain was blinding. This was the end, the final boundary. Her inner wolf, the silent, invisible creature that had curled into a dying state since the severing of the mate bond, suddenly shifted. The beast did not cower. It did not whine for mercy. It did not seek the toxic shadow of the werewolf keep. Instead, it rose on unsteady legs within the cage of her ribs. It pressed its snout against the metaphysical bars, sniffing the overwhelming heat with a strange, desperate hunger. The woman raised her right hand. Her fingers were blue-tipped, trembling violently from exhaustion and systemic shock. The silver silk hanging from her arm was charred at the edges. She examined her own hand, a fragile, battered thing, made of flesh and brittle bone, suspended mere inches from a magical furnace that had reduced powerful warriors to dust. She did not close her eyes. She kept them open, her metallic gaze locked on the burning red seam of the iron. She pressed her bare palm flat against the mythic gateway. She braced for the end. She waited for the explosion of fire, for the agonizing rush of incineration that had claimed so many before her. It did not come. Instead, a profound, shocking silence swallowed the howling wind. For one long, suspended heartbeat, the universe simply held its breath. Then, the moment her skin fully registered the ancient metal, a fierce ripple of energy blasted outward. But it did not burn. It was a wave of freezing, terrifying force that instantly snuffed out the angry red glow of the defense magic. The blistering heat vanished. It was replaced by a sudden, rushing sensation of cool water washing over scorched earth. Saren gasped. The breath she took was no longer choked with sulfur and ash. It was clean. It tasted of rain, ozone, crushing ancient power. Beneath her palm, the black iron began to change. The bleeding red light, trapped in the carved scales, flickered. It stuttered. Then it flared into a brilliant, blinding, molten gold. The golden light raced outward from her touch. It traced the intricate, spiraling patterns of the carved dragons, illuminating the massive doors in a web of living, breathing magic. The ground beneath her boots trembled. A deep, seismic vibration rattled the marrow in her bones. The compacted ash of the fallen blew away, scattered by a sudden, pure wind that smelled of blooming hearths and unbroken stone. Her hand did not burn. The metal beneath her skin felt impossibly cool, smooth as polished glass, vibrating with a desperate, frantic joy. The magic recognized her. It sank into her flesh, bypassing her skin to flood her veins. The golden energy rushed into her chest. It wrapped around the bleeding, torn edges of her severed mate bond like a soothing, heavy bandage. Her inner wolf let out a long, shuddering exhale. It collapsed into the warmth, finally finding a sanctuary. It had never known in the harsh hierarchy of the werewolf pack. A deafening crack echoed through the narrow mountain pass. It was the sound of a centuries-old seal breaking. With the grinding shriek of uncounted tons of metal shifting against stone, the massive doors began to open. Saren let her hand drop to her side. She stood perfectly still as the barrier parted outward, dragging deep trenches into the volcanic rock. The gate that had stood impassable for an age yielded. It yielded to the touch of a broken, discarded exile. The red glow of the outer wastes faded, entirely eclipsed by the brilliant, warm light spilling from the cavernous tunnel ahead. She looked into the heart of the mountain. The sudden wash of golden illumination cascaded over her frozen cheeks, a rich, blooming heat that melted the last remnants of ash from her eyelashes. It was a localized summer against her shivering, ruined skin, chasing the brutal winter chill from her joints. The threshold was a boundary between two entirely different realms. Behind her lay the freezing, toxic ashlands and a life of constant, unspoken inadequacy under Julian's reign. Before her stretched a massive, vaulted tunnel carved directly through the roots of the mountain. It was illuminated by glowing veins of golden crystal embedded in the rock. The air here was heavy, but not with oppression. It was heavy with the weight of dormant life, a rich, oxygen-dense atmosphere that made her dizzy with its purity. She took a step forward. She crossed the threshold. Her body, which had been running purely on the fumes of her sheer willpower, finally registered that the immediate threat of freezing to death was gone. Her knees buckled. The sudden absence of the bitter cold was almost as disorienting as the blast of golden magic. Saren stumbled, catching herself against the smooth, cool inner wall of the tunnel. Her breathing was ragged. Her chest heaved as the warm, pristine air flooded her damaged lungs. She leaned her forehead against the stone, closing her eyes for just a fraction of a second. She was alive. Pack Elder Kalen Mercer had been wrong. The Alpha King had been wrong. The world was full of teeth, but this ancient iron jaw had refused to bite her. A sound broke the absolute stillness. It was not the wind, it was a footstep. Saren's eyes snapped open. She pushed herself away from the wall, her spine instantly straightening into that unbending pillar of quiet defiance. She refused to be found cowering. Even here, she would meet whatever came next on her feet. Deep within the golden illumination of the tunnel, a shadow detached itself from the architecture. The footfalls were deliberate, impossibly heavy. They carried the rhythmic cadence of a predator that had never known a natural enemy. Each step resonated through the stone floor, sending faint, rhythmic vibrations up through the soles of her battered boots. A figure emerged from the glowing mists of the ancient corridor. He was a titan of a man, built on a scale that made the largest warriors of the werewolf clan look like fragile boys. He stood well over 6.5 feet tall, his shoulders impossibly broad beneath a mantle of heavy, overlapping armor. The metal of his chest plate was not the crude, forged iron of the werewolf clans, but a seamless dark alloy that shifted in the light, resembling the hardened scales of a mythical beast, the Golden Dragon King. Aurelius Drake. He had been asleep for centuries, sealed away behind the burning iron, waiting for the one trace of blood that could break the curse of his isolation. As he stepped fully into the light, the sheer terrifying gravity of his presence hit Saren like a physical blow. The air around him seemed to warp and shimmer with restrained, devastating power. He stopped 10 paces away. The exile stared at the ancient sovereign. His face was a masterpiece of harsh, aristocratic angles, beautiful in the way a drawn blade was beautiful. His jaw was square and dark with a short, rough shadow of a beard, his cheekbones high and sharp enough to cut glass. Heavy dark hair fell past his shoulders untamed and slightly dusted with the fine, golden powder of his long slumber, but it was his eyes that pinned her in place. They were not the stormy human grey of her former mate. They were a brilliant, burning amber, slit vertically like a reptile's, glowing with an intense, inhuman luminescence in the dim tunnel. Those eyes held the weight of centuries, the predatory stillness of a creature that could level mountains with a single breath. Aurelius looked at her. Saren did not look away. She was exhausted, freezing, bleeding, and dressed in the torn, filthy ruins of a silver silk wedding gown. Her dark hair was matted with ash, her skin pale and bruised. She was the definition of broken. Yet she lifted her chin, meeting the burning gaze of a god with the cold, unflinching stare of a survivor. She waited for the judgment. She waited for the colossal being to demand her purpose, to strike her down for daring to trespass in his sacred domain. The ancient sovereign inhaled. It was a deep breath. His chest expanded against the heavy dark armor. The amber slits of his pupils dilated, swallowing the gold until his eyes were almost entirely black. The lethal, terrifying stillness that surrounded him fractured. A muscle feathered in his jaw. His hands, massive and encased in scaled gauntlets, twitched at his sides. The crushing, dominant aura of the apex predator instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden, shocking vulnerability that the woman could feel vibrating in the very air between them. He took a step forward, then another. Seren held her ground. She forced her hands to remain relaxed at her sides. She would not show fear. The towering monarch closed the distance between them. He was close enough now that she could feel the immense ambient heat radiating from his body. A gentle, localized warmth. It chased the remaining winter chill from her bones. He smelled of wood smoke, old parchment, the deep, rich scent of amber. Aurelius did not reach for her. He did not loom over her to assert his dominance. Instead, the king, a being of absolute mythic destruction, lowered his massive frame. The sound of his knee, striking the stone floor, echoed loudly in the quiet tunnel. Saren's breath hitched in her throat. Her eyes widened. The stoic mask finally cracked in the face of sheer, impossible disbelief. He knelt, a king in the dirt. Bowing to an exile, he bowed his head, his dark hair falling forward to obscure the harsh lines of his face. He made himself small, bringing his eye level down below hers, an explicit physical declaration of absolute submission. His scaled hands rested open on his armored thighs, palms up, revealing he carried no weapon, proving he meant no harm. "You are bleeding." His voice was a low, resonant rumble, a sound that vibrated deep in the center of her chest. It was not a roar. It was a quiet, ragged whisper, heavy with an emotion that sounded terrifyingly like reverence. She looked down at the massive man kneeling at her broken boots. She did not know how to process this. She had spent 5 years being told she was too small, too weak, too inadequate to stand beside a lesser ruler. She had been publicly stripped of her dignity, banished to die because Melissa Vance wanted her crown, and Julian was blind enough to give it away. And now, the most dangerous creature in the fated realms was bowing to her as if she were the only thing keeping the sky from falling. "I am fine," Saren said. Her voice was raspy, scraped raw from the toxic ash and the agonizing silence she had maintained for 3 days. Aurelius lifted his head. The burning amber of his eyes met hers again, and this time, the intensity in them was not predatory. It was a desperate, fierce devotion. "You are the last of the bloodline," the ancient sovereign murmured. His gaze traced the lines of her exhausted face. He lingered on the frostbitten edges of her skin, the dark bruises under her eyes. "You carry the scent of the first queens. The gate recognized you. He swallowed hard, a heavy, difficult movement. "I have waited a very long time for you to come home." He didn't ask about her lack of a wolf. He didn't ask why she was dressed in rags. He didn't look at her as if she were a defective, broken thing. He looked at her as if she were a crown he had thought lost forever to the abyss. Saren stared at him. The physical pain in her chest, the lingering agony of the public rejection, throbbed a dull, distant rhythm. She was so tired. The sheer willpower required to keep her spine straight was finally running out. I have no home, she whispered. The truth slipped past her defenses before she could stop it. I have been banished. Aurelius's hands curled into fists. The gentle warmth radiating from his body suddenly spiked. A flash of pure, territorial fury made the golden veins in the tunnel walls flare blindingly bright. But he did not stand. He remained firmly on his knee. He forced the violent instinct down. He refused to let his anger frighten her. You were cast out by blind, foolish dogs who could not see the sun if it blinded them, the Dragon King rumbled. His voice dropped an octave, laced with a dangerous, lethal promise. They looked at a dragon and saw only a wingless wolf. Their ignorance is not your truth. He unclasped the heavy, dark mantle from his own shoulders. It was a massive cloak of spun black wool, lined with a soft, incredibly warm golden fur that seemed to generate its own heat. He held it out to her. He did not drape it over her shoulders. He did not presume to touch her without permission. He simply offered it, his scarred hands holding the fabric steady, waiting for her choice. Not used, not owned, chosen. The words echoed in the back of Saren's mind, a quiet revelation. Her eyes settled on the heavy cloak. She inspected the bruised, bleeding skin of her own bare arms. The cold was gone, but the chill of the betrayal still lingered in her blood. She needed warmth. She needed safety. She reached out. Her trembling, blue-tipped fingers brushed against the dense, golden fur of the mantle. The moment her skin made contact with the fabric, and by extension, the lingering heat of the man holding it, a jolt of pure, restorative energy shot up her arm. It was not the violent, agonizing tear of a werewolf bond. It was a deep, resonating hum, a frequency of magic that perfectly matched the quiet, ancient song of her own dormant soul. Aurelius exhaled a ragged breath as her fingers brushed the fur. His amber eyes tracked her movement. He tracked the exact moment the tension began to bleed out of her rigid shoulders. She took the cloak. The sovereign allowed her to pull it from his hands. She wrapped the heavy, dark wool around her shivering frame. It was massive, swallowing her small figure entirely, but the weight of it was grounding. The dense golden fur against her skin was softer than anything she had ever felt. It radiated a deep, penetrating heat that immediately began to soothe her aching joints and raw flesh. It smelled of him, of safety, of ancient power, a fortress that could never be breached. Saren pulled the edges of the mantle tight across her chest. She buried her chin in the heavy collar. For the first time in 3 days, she allowed her eyes to close and simply breathe. Aurelius stayed on his knee. He watched her sink into the warmth of his protection. His expression was a mask of solemn, unwavering duty. "You are safe now," he said quietly. The words were a sacred vow echoing in the ancient stone. "No one will ever make you walk in the cold again, and those who tried." The golden light in his eyes flared, bright and terrifying. "We'll learn exactly why the iron was built to keep us in." The silence that followed his vow was heavy, but it was not the oppressive, mocking silence of the red-toothed banquet hall. It was a protective barrier, a quiet space where the frantic, bleeding energy of her severed mate bond was finally allowed to rest. Saren stood wrapped in the mantle, letting the profound heat seep through the frozen layers of her muscles. The physical deterioration she had suffered in the outer wastes was severe. Her nervous system, previously locked in a state of absolute survival, began to unravel. The erratic, painful rhythm of her heart slowed to a steady, heavy beat. The sharp, microscopic cuts on her face and hands from the flying ash stopped stinging, numbed by the ambient magic radiating from the fur. She looked down at the man who was still kneeling before her. It was a staggering juxtaposition. The ancient sovereign possessed enough raw physical strength to snap a wolf's neck with a flick of his wrist. His armor was scarred with the marks of ancient, cataclysmic battles. Yet here he was, perfectly still, his massive frame bowed, deliberately making himself a shield between her and the harsh world outside. He was giving her the one thing the Alpha King had stripped away in front of 300 people. Absolute, unquestioned dignity. Julian had demanded she hand over her silver crest while standing above her, surrounded by laughing sycophants. He had used his height, his title, and his pack to dwarf her existence. This sovereign, entirely alone in the dark, had given her his warmth and knelt in the dirt, expecting nothing in return but the privilege of her presence. Saren's inner wolf, which had found temporary solace when she touched the iron gate, now curled up entirely within the golden warmth of his proximity. The beast let out a soft, contented sigh in the depths of her mind. It was a bizarre sensation. She had spent her entire life believing her inner wolf was defective, a mute, useless phantom that could not shift and could not protect her. Now, she realized it had not been defective. It had been starving. It had been an ancient, winged soul trapped in the body of a land-bound canine, waiting for a frequency of magic that the werewolf packs simply did not possess. "Why did you wake?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper, muffled slightly by the heavy collar of the cloak. Aurelius shifted, his armored knee grinding softly against the stone floor. He kept his hands open and visible on his thighs. "The gate is bound to the lifeblood of the true monarchs," he explained. His deep voice moved through the quiet air like rolling thunder. "It was designed to burn any lesser creature to ash, to keep the world of teeth out, to keep our slumber unbroken until the era of ash was over. But it was also designed to yield, to recognize the return of the fated hire." He looked up at her, the glowing amber of his eyes fixed on her pale face. "When your hand touched the iron, the magic tasted your blood. It felt the fracture in your soul, the agony of a bond that had been violently torn. The magic did not just open to let you in, Saren. It opened to scream for me to wake up and protect you." He knew her name. She blinked. A sudden, sharp shock pierced through her exhaustion. "How do you know my name?" "The barrier connects to the root of the mountain, and the mountain connects to my mind," Aurelius said softly. "When you touched the metal, for a fraction of a second, I felt everything you felt. I felt the freezing wind. I felt the sharp edge of the volcanic rock." His jaw tightened, the muscle ticking wildly again. "And I felt the echo of the man who dared to tell you that you were worthless." The raw, possessive fury in his tone was terrifying, yet Saren did not feel a single ounce of fear. His anger was a directed weapon. For the first time in her life, the weapon was pointed outward, away from her, aimed entirely at her enemies. "He is an Alpha King," she stated. The words were flat, devoid of emotion. She was not defending her former mate. She was simply stating the geopolitical reality she had been raised to fear. "He commands the werewolf stronghold. He has 300 warriors." Aurelius let out a sound that was half rumble, half scoff. It was a dark, dismissive noise. "He is a boy playing with shadows in a mud pit," the ancient sovereign corrected. His voice was laced with absolute terrifying certainty. "He commands dogs. He has broken a sacred law of nature by casting out a dragon hair. His numbers, his keep, his crown, they are dust waiting for the wind." He raised one of his massive hands. He stopped halfway. His scaled gauntlet hovered in the air between them. His amber eyes silently asked for permission. She considered the outstretched hand. She gave a single, microscopic nod. Aurelius moved with agonizing deliberation. He reached out, gently. So gently, it was barely a physical touch. He brushed a streak of toxic grey ash from the curve of her cheek. His metal gauntlet was warm. The magic hummed beneath the alloy. "You have survived the outer wastes," the king murmured, pulling his hand back immediately after clearing the dirt from her skin. "You have survived the cruelty of lesser men. Your trial is over. From this moment on, you will not fight alone. You will not walk alone. My life, my strength, and my kingdom belong entirely to you." She closed her eyes. The weight of his words settled over her like a second heavier cloak. She had walked to the ancient barrier, expecting to find a quick, fiery death. Instead, she had found a titan in the dark, a protector who wore his immense power only to shield her from the cold. "Come," Aurelius said gently. He finally broke his kneeling posture. He rose to his feet, a slow unfolding of massive muscle and dark armor. Standing, he was a mountain of a man, casting a long shadow down the tunnel, but he kept a respectful distance, ensuring he did not crowd her small space. The deep valleys wait beyond this tunnel. There are warm hearths, the elixir of the sunken well to heal the tearing in your chest. Let me take you home. Saren opened her eyes. She looked back over her shoulder, past the colossal, open doors of the gate, out into the freezing, ash-choked nightmare of the world that had thrown her away. The distant howling had stopped, likely silenced by the sheer terror of witnessing the mythical barrier open. She turned her back on the snow. She turned her back on the pack. She gazed at the Golden Dragon King, who stood waiting in the warm, glowing light, offering her a sanctuary she had never dared to dream of. Saren adjusted the heavy, golden-furred mantle on her shoulders. She lifted her chin with a quiet, unbending grace. "Lead the way," she said. The journey through the roots of the mountain was a passage between two existences. Saren Voss followed the massive, armored form of the Golden Dragon King. The tunnel floor was incredibly smooth, worn to a glassy finish by centuries of ancient footfalls. Yet her ruined boots dragged against the stone. The sheer adrenaline that had carried her through the freezing ashlands and pushed her hand against the incinerating iron was rapidly fading. In its absence, a profound, crushing exhaustion began to settle into her marrow. The air grew denser, the bitter, metallic bite of the outer wastes, the scent of sulfur and dormant volcanoes, was gradually replaced by the rich, heavy aroma of crushed pine, warm honey, and blooming hearths. Then the thawing began. It was an agonizing biological process. The frostbite that had numbed her extremities for 2 days started to break. The frozen capillaries in her fingers and toes violently expanded as the ambient heat of the tunnel seeped into her skin. It felt as though thousands of microscopic, burning needles were being driven directly into her joints. A sudden, brutal tremor racked her slim frame. She bit down hard on the inside of her cheek. The sudden, copper taste of her own blood flooded her mouth. She did not cry out. She simply locked her knees and forced herself to take another step. Aurelius stopped. The heavy, rhythmic cadence of his iron boots ceased. He turned, the broad plates of his dark alloy armor shifting with a low, menacing grind. His burning amber eyes locked onto her pale face. He watched the subtle, violent tremors racking her body. He saw the tight, white-knuckled grip she maintained on the edges of the golden-furred mantle. He understood immediately. "The Frost is a coward," the ancient sovereign rumbled. His voice echoed softly off the glowing crystal veins embedded in the tunnel walls. "It bites the deepest when it is forced to retreat." He did not offer her pity. Pity was an insult reserved for the weak, and the towering monarch looked at her as if she were made of indestructible steel. Instead, he offered a quiet, unwavering respect. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. "You have walked far enough on your own, Saren," he said quietly. The formidable apex predator made a deliberate show of keeping his scaled hands open and visible. "There is no weakness in letting another carry the weight. Allow me." Saren looked at the towering monarch. She was so tired. The sheer effort required to keep her spine straight was a war she was rapidly losing. She gave a single, faint nod. Aurelius moved with impossible gentleness. For a creature capable of crushing boulders into dust, his touch was lighter than the falling snow. He stooped, sliding one heavy arm behind her knees and the other across her back, lifting her from the stone floor. The contrast was staggering. He was a fortress of dark iron and hard muscle, yet he cradled her against his chest plate as if she were spun glass. He ensured that no sharp edge of his armor pressed against her bruised skin. The heat radiating from his body was immense, a localized, roaring furnace that chased the remaining winter chill violently from her blood. Saren rested her head against the heavy fur of the mantle, closing her eyes as the rhythmic, swaying motion of his stride carried her forward. They emerged from the tunnel. The Golden Valley opened before them, a colossal caldera shielded from the harsh world by impassable jagged peaks. It was an explosion of life and light. The sky above was a vibrant, unbroken azure, entirely free of the toxic grey ash that choked the werewolf borders. Ancient pale stone architecture was woven seamlessly into the living rock of the mountainside. Terraced gardens bloomed with golden flora, and cascading waterfalls of glowing, bioluminescent water plummeted into deep, quiet pools. It was a realm of eternal summer, a sanctuary designed to keep the world of teeth completely at bay. Aurelius carried her through the winding, sun-baked stone paths. The dragon people they passed, tall, regal figures draped in rich silks and light armor, did not crowd them. They stopped. They lowered their heads in complete, silent reverence. No one pointed, no one whispered cruel mockeries. The king bypassed the grand central plazas, carrying her directly into a secluded, cavernous chamber carved from pure white marble. This was the sunken well. At the center of the room lay a natural basin filled with glowing, liquid gold. The elixir, thick steam rose from the surface, carrying the heavy, intoxicating scent of crushed lotus, hot minerals, and ancient magic. Aurelius gently lowered her onto a wide, cushioned bench at the edge of the water. "The elixir will draw the poison of the wastes from your skin," he explained, his voice a low, soothing vibration in the quiet chamber. "It will mend the fracture in your chest. Take all the time you require." He stepped backward. He bowed his head deeply, retreating toward the heavy stone archway of the entrance. "I will stand guard outside," he promised. "Nothing will cross that threshold." He turned and left, offering her the ultimate luxury the old fortress had never provided, complete, unmonitored privacy. Saren sat alone in the steam. She reached up and unclasped the heavy mantle, setting the golden fur carefully aside. Then her bruised, trembling fingers moved to the ruined fabric of her dress. The silver silk wedding gown, the physical manifestation of her public humiliation, was stiff with dried blood, toxic ash, and frozen dirt. She let it fall to the marble floor with a heavy, wet thud. She would never wear silver again. She stepped down into the sunken well. The transition was a sudden, sensory shock, and Saren paused on the first step to let her body process the shift. The water was incredibly dense. It felt less like liquid and more like liquid silk, humming with a low, resonant frequency against her skin. The blistering memory of the outer ashlands and the incinerating gate faded entirely. The temperature here was flawless. It was a deep, penetrating heat that sank immediately past her epidermis, reaching directly into her aching joints. The moment she submerged herself to the collarbone, the physical healing began. The elixir pulled the remaining grey ash from her pores, turning the water around her momentarily dark before the golden light consumed the impurities. The sharp, blue-tinged edges of her frostbite faded, replaced by the healthy, flushed color of living tissue. The crescent-shaped cuts in her palms, the wounds she had inflicted upon herself to maintain her silent composure when Julian Sterling crowned Melissa Vance, knit together in seconds, leaving smooth, unblemished skin behind. But the physical wounds were nothing compared to the spiritual damage. The severed mate bond was a jagged, bleeding crater in the center of her chest. Her former kin had used that fated tether as a leash, and Julian's public rejection had violently snapped it, leaving the frayed, toxic edges of werewolf magic embedded in her soul. The glowing water seeped into her chest. It found the broken edges of the bond. It did not merely numb the pain. It went to war with it. The ancient, dragon-blooded magic of the elixir recognized the lingering, inferior trace of the Alpha King's claim. It burned the remnants of Julian's scent away. The The phantom agony that had been suffocating Saren for 3 days suddenly dissolved. The tight, constricting cage around her lungs shattered. She took a deep, dragging breath, filling her chest entirely. The spiritual void closed, sealed shut by the pure, unyielding warmth of the golden well. She was no longer tethered to a man who despised her. She was anchored entirely to herself. Deep within the subconscious caverns of her mind, her inner wolf reacted. For 5 years, Julian and Kaelin Mercer had called the beast a defective, mute runt, a useless, non-shifting anomaly. As the elixir flooded Saren's system, the dormant creature finally stood. It shook off the psychological chains of the werewolf pack. It expanded. The illusion of canine fur melted away. Heavy, impenetrable scales formed along its spine. Immense, leathery wings unfolded within the vastness of her soul, stretching wide enough to block out the sun. It let out a silent, earth-shaking roar. It had never been a wolf. It had been a dragon, slowly suffocating inside a dog's cage. Saren opened her eyes. The silvery irises, previously clouded by exhaustion and silent grief, were now sharp, clear, and perfectly calm. The last trace of the terrified Omega vanished into the steam. An hour later, Saren emerged from the bathing chamber. She was physically whole. The crushing fatigue was gone, replaced by a deep, thrumming reservoir of kinetic strength. On a low table near the basin, she had found garments left for her. She was now dressed in a gown of spun golden silk. It was completely free of the restrictive, heavy corsetry favored by the canine court. It draped elegantly over her frame, light as air, but incredibly warm, catching the ambient light with every subtle movement. She walked out of the arched doorway. Aurelius was waiting in the wide stone corridor. He had removed his heavy, dark alloy armor. He wore a simple, dark tunic that emphasized the intimidating breadth of his shoulders and the thick, corded muscles of his arms. The visual of the towering monarch without his armor was somehow more daunting. He was a landscape of raw, lethal power, holding itself perfectly still. When he heard her approach, he turned. His amber eyes tracked over her. He took in the absence of bruises, the steady rhythm of her breathing, and the proud, unbent line of her spine. He did not look at her with the possessive, controlling hunger of an alpha. He looked at her with the profound, breathless awe of a believer witnessing a miracle. "The elixir has served its purpose," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You look as you were always meant to. I feel." Saren paused, searching for the word, unhollowed. Aurelius offered a slow, sharp smile. "Come, there are people who have waited centuries to see you." He led her out of the corridor and onto a vast, sweeping balcony that overlooked the central plaza of the Golden Valley. The sensory impact was immediate and staggering. The plaza below was enormous, paved in interlocking stones of white and gold, and it was full. Thousands of the dragon people had gathered. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a sea of warriors, scholars, and ancient elders. As Saren and Aurelius stepped up to the carved stone balustrade, a ripple moved through the endless crowd. There was no chaotic shouting. There was no raucous, animalistic howling like the deafening noise of the red-toothed banquet hall. Instead, the crowd moved in perfect, overwhelming unison. With the sound of rustling silk and shifting leather, thousands of people sank to their knees. They bowed their heads, exposing their necks in the ultimate, instinctual display of pure submission. The silence that followed was heavier than the mountain itself. It was absolute, unfiltered reverence. Saren gripped the cool stone of the balustrade. She had spent 5 years enduring the mocking laughter of a pack that viewed her as a curse. Now, she stood before a legion of beings who possessed enough raw power to level the world, and they were kneeling at her feet. A heavy footstep sounded behind them. Saren turned as a figure stepped onto the balcony from a side archway. It was a man clad in form-fitting, silver-scaled armor. A long, dark cape spilled from his shoulders. His face was lean and angular, his eyes a sharp, analytical silver that mirrored her own. This was Zephyr Thorn, the Dragon Commander. Unlike the sycophantic, bitter pack elder Kalen Mercer, who leaned on a stick and spat cruel insults, Zephyr radiated a quiet, lethal competence. He did not hesitate. He immediately dropped to one knee, bringing his right fist sharply across his chest plate in a traditional salute. "My king," Zephyr said, his voice crisp and clear. He then shifted his gaze slightly, looking directly into Saren's eyes. "My queen." Aurelius bid him rise with a subtle gesture of his hand. "The mountain sang when the gate opened," Zephyr reported, stepping forward. He looked at Saren with a mixture of clinical observation and deep, abiding respect. The ancient records were true. The bloodline survived the theft. Saren frowned, the golden silk of her gown rustling as she shifted her weight. "Theft? I was born into the Red Tooth Pack. My parents were wolves. Your parents were jailers," Aurelius corrected gently. He gestured for her to sit in a high-backed, intricately carved wooden chair positioned on the terrace. He remained standing beside her, a towering sentinel at her right shoulder. Zephyr approached the low table nearby, pouring a cup of warm, spiced nectar and offering it to Saren before he spoke. "The werewolf packs have always feared what they could not control," the commander explained, his tone even, though a dark undercurrent of historical fury laced his words. "Centuries ago, during the Great Fracture, the Alphas realized our magic was tied to the land. They raided the outer borders. They stole the daughters of the Dragon Clan. They believed that if they bred our lineage into their packs, they could steal the strength of the sky and use it to dominate the dirt." Saren stared at the warm cup in her hands. The steam curled into the air, vanishing into the golden afternoon light. "But dragon blood does not serve," Aurelius rumbled, his amber eyes narrowing as he looked out over the kneeling city. "It cannot be forced into a lesser's mold. It goes dormant. It sleeps. It waits for the right frequency of magic to awaken." Zephyr nodded. "You were born into Julian's territory, Saren, but you are not of them. The reason you had no wolf, the reason you could not shift, is because you are not a canine." The commander's silver eyes locked onto hers with piercing intensity. "You carry the unbroken, concentrated lineage of the first queens. Your soul was trapped in a lesser vessel, surrounded by toxic ambient magic, waiting for the iron gate to set it free." The hushed silence on the balcony stretched, broken only by the distant, soothing sound of the waterfalls. Saren processed the words, the history, the revelation. The cruel illusion of her entire existence shattered in an instant. Julian Sterling had not rejected a defective weak Omega. He had discarded a sleeping dragon because he was too arrogant and too blind to recognize the ancient, awe-inspiring power standing right in front of him. He had traded a living god for the poisoned honey of Melissa Vance. "They made you believe you were hollow," Aurelius said, his voice dropping to a fierce, protective whisper. He reached out, his warm fingers lightly brushing the back of her chair. "They convinced you that your silence was a flaw. They used your endurance as a footstool for their own fragile egos. But you are the foundation of this empire, Saren." Saren looked down at her own hands. The crescent scars were gone. The frostbite was a memory. The hollow, agonizing ache of the werewolf bond was completely erased, replaced by the thrumming, vital heartbeat of the glowing city. She slowly lifted her head. Her silver-grey eyes were no longer calm. They were hard. They were beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful. "Julian Sterling crowned his mistress because he believed she was strong," Saren stated. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the chilling, fatal edge of a Glientin dropping in an empty courtyard. "He believed in a brittle illusion," the sovereign replied. His amber eyes flared with a lethal burning light, and a slow, fierce smile curved his lips. "When the time comes, my queen, we will show him exactly what true strength looks like." The words settled into the warm evening air, heavy with the weight of prophecy. Zephyr Thorn rose from his knee, his silver-scaled armor catching the fading light of the caldera. He bowed his head respectfully to Saren before turning back to his king. The scouts report movement in the outer ashlands. Julian Sterling's trackers have not retreated. They are circling the perimeter of the scorched threshold, likely waiting for the embers to cool, so they might sift through the ashes for her bones. Saren did not flinch. 3 days ago, the thought of Julian's trackers hunting her would have sent her heart racing into a frantic, terrified rhythm. Now, her pulse remained perfectly steady. The thrumming, resonant power of the Golden Valley anchored her. She looked out over the sea of kneeling dragon warriors, processing the sheer magnitude of the unyielding force at her command. "Let them sift," Saren said quietly. Zephyr looked at her, his silver eyes flashing with sharp approval. "They will find nothing but dead stone and their own impending ruin," Aurelius added, his voice a low, perilous rumble. "But tonight, the Queen rests. The fracture in her soul is sealed, but the body must align with the awakened blood. Zephyr, secure the inner perimeter. No shadow crosses the threshold of the valley." "At once, my king." The commander executed a flawless salute and vanished into the arched corridors of the palace. Aurelius turned to Saren. He offered his hand. It was a broad, scarred hand, heavily calloused from centuries of warfare, yet he held it completely still. He did not demand she take it. He offered the choice. Saren placed her palm against his. The physical contrast was stark. Her skin was pale and smooth, glowing with the residual magic of the sunken well. His was dark and weathered, radiating that immense, localized furnace heat. His fingers curled gently around hers, a protective cage that felt entirely safe. He led her from the balcony. They walked through the sprawling, pale stone corridors of the royal wing. The architecture here was unlike the oppressive, claustrophobic stone of Julian's stronghold. There were no heavy iron portcullises or dark, damp dungeons where omegas were sent to be forgotten. Everything was open. Tall, arched windows let in the vibrant azure light of the sky, and the air smelled heavily of crushed pine and blooming night jasmine. He brought her to a set of soaring, intricately carved doors. "These were the chamber of the first queens," Aurelius said softly, pushing the heavy wooden panels open. The room was breathtaking. It was a vast, circular sanctuary carved directly into the living heart of the mountain. A massive hearth burned along the far wall, casting a rich, golden glow over the plush rugs and heavy silken draperies. A grand bed sat in the center of the room, piled high with thick furs and spun gold linens. It was a space built for safety, built for reverence. "You will not be disturbed here," Aurelius promised. He released her hand slowly, taking a deliberate step backward. The sheer physical restraint of the man was staggering. He was a creature capable of leveling mountains, yet he chained his own violent instincts to ensure she never felt cornered. "I will be in the adjacent hall. If you require anything, you need only speak." Saren stepped into the room. She gazed at the blazing hearth. She thought of the freezing, drafty corner of the pack-house Julian had banished her to long before the actual rejection. She thought of the mocking whispers, the deliberate cruelty of Melissa Vance parading through the halls, the sycophantic sneers of Kaelan Mercer. That life was a ghost, vanished like smoke through a crack in the world. "Aurelius," she said. The Golden Dragon King paused in the doorway. He turned, his amber eyes locking onto hers. "Thank you," she whispered. It was the first time her voice had wavered, just slightly, under the sheer weight of her gratitude. She did not cry. She simply acknowledged the profound tectonic shift in her reality. Aurelius closed the distance in a heartbeat. He did not touch her. He simply went down on one knee upon the plush rug, lowering his head until he was eye-level with her waist. He pressed his fist over his heart in a gesture of pure devotion. "You owe me no thanks, Saren," he rumbled fiercely. "I have waited centuries in the dark, suffocating on the ashes of this world, hoping against reason that the ancient seal would be broken." You did not just open the gate. You brought the sun back to my kingdom." He looked up, and his eyes were completely bare. Stripped of the invincible apex predator, leaving only the devoted, penitent sovereign who had finally found his equal. "I am yours to command," he swore, "now and until the mountains crumble." Saren looked down at the king kneeling before her. She reached out. Her fingers brushed the thick, dark hair at the nape of his neck. It was a simple, quiet gesture. A touch she had never dared to offer Julian Sterling, for fear of a violent reprimand. Aurelius let out a rough, shuddering exhale. He leaned into her touch, completely submitting to the gentle pressure of her hand. For the first time in 5 years, Saren Voss was truly safe. The warmth of the hearth seeped into her bones, solidifying the ancient magic that now hummed steadily through her veins. Tomorrow, the winged ruler would march. Tomorrow, the canine clan would learn the true cost of their arrogance. But tonight, the queen simply closed her eyes and breathed. She let the heavy, golden silence of the mountain cradle her. She sank into a deep, dreamless sleep, finally undisturbed by the shadows of her past. The night passed in an unbroken, heavy silence, cradling her in a restorative dark she had not known since childhood. When she finally woke, morning in the Golden Valley did not arrive, with the harsh, freezing bite of the werewolf territories. It bloomed. The light that filtered through the arched windows of the chamber of the first queens was a rich, liquid amber. It poured over the spun gold linens and the heavy silk draperies, casting long, warm shadows across the plush rugs. Saren Voss opened her eyes. For the first time in 5 years, she did not wake with a subconscious flinch. There was no immediate, hollow ache in her chest, bracing for a cruel remark from Julian Sterling, nor the agonizing dread of a cold shoulder from her former pack. The freezing weight of the Alpha's citadel and its brutal hierarchy was completely gone. In its place, a steady, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through her veins. It was the ancient magic of the elixir of the sunken well, permanently fused with her awakened bloodline. It coursed through her system like liquid heat, repairing every microscopic fracture left behind by the brutal severance of her mate bond. Beneath her ribs, the inner beast that Julian had mocked as a defective, magicless runt stretched its massive metaphysical wings. It did not whimper in fear. It breathed a quiet, contained fire into her soul, anchoring her in unwavering certainty. She sat up, the shimmering golden fabric she had been given, draped flawlessly over her shoulders. Her skin, previously bruised, frostbitten and torn by the merciless winds of the great ashlands, was pristine. It was smooth, flushed with health, and humming with a kinetic energy that demanded movement. At the foot of the massive bed rested Aurelius's golden-furred mantle, a physical testament to the absolute protection she now commanded. The heavy-spun black wool and warm golden fur still carried the deep, grounding scent of cedar and burning embers, a scent that belonged entirely to the sovereign who had knelt before her the previous night. Then, the profound serenity of the sanctuary shattered. It was not a loud, chaotic noise like the banging of iron goblets in a banquet hall. It was a deep, resonant vibration, a low, continuous hum that began deep within the living rock of the mountain and traveled upward, vibrating through the soles of her bare feet. The crystal veins embedded in the stone walls flared from a soft ambient glow to a sharp pulsing crimson, a warning. Saren did not panic. Her metallic eyes remained perfectly clear, devoid of the terrified static that used to cloud them during her time as a subjugated Omega. She stood, her spine aligning into that unbending pillar of quiet defiance, and walked toward the heavy, intricately carved doors. Before she could reach the latch, she heard the low, tense voices in the adjacent hall. She pushed the wooden panels open. Aurelius Drake stood in the center of the antechamber. He had already discarded the simple dark tunic from the previous night. He was once again encased in his terrifying obsidian plating. The massive plates shifted with a lethal, grinding sound as he turned toward a large, circular stone table, carved with a topographical map of the fated realms. Zephyr Thorn stood across from him. The Dragon Commander's silver-scaled armor reflected the pulsing crimson light of the mountain's alarm. His face was a mask of cold, analytical fury, beautiful the way a blade was beautiful. They both stopped speaking the moment Saren stepped over the threshold. Aurelius turned entirely toward her. The immense, radiating heat from his massive frame immediately softened, dialed back by sheer, voluntary restraint. His burning amber eyes swept over her, cataloguing her calm expression, the steady rise and fall of her chest, ensuring the blaring alarm had not caused her any distress. He was a creature of apocalyptic destruction, yet around her he tempered his very existence to offer nothing but absolute safety. "My queen," Aurelius murmured. His voice was a low rumble that settled the sudden atmospheric tension in the room. He bowed his head, a microscopic gesture of deep respect that no alpha had ever offered her. Certainly not the man who had worn the iron crown of the Red Tooth Keep. "What is that sound?" Saren asked. Her voice was steady. It did not tremble, nor did she cross her arms in a defensive posture. Zephyr struck his fist across his chest plate in a crisp salute before answering. "The mountain's perimeter wards have been triggered, my queen. The outer crags are being scaled." Saren moved closer to the stone table, her bare feet silent against the polished marble floor. "By whom?" "Julian Sterling's border trackers," the commander reported, his tone laced with a dark, aristocratic disgust. They did not retreat into the tree line when the ancient seal opened. The massive release of ancient magic caused the ambient temperature of the outer wastes to plummet. The sulphurous smoke cleared. They realized you were not incinerated against the ancient iron. The sovereign's jaw tightened. The muscle ticked violently beneath his shadowed cheek. His armored hands gripped the edge of the stone map so hard the ancient granite began to spiderweb with hairline fractures. He hated the very mention of the wolves who had driven her to the brink of death. "They saw the golden light," Aurelius growled. The sound was purely draconic, a terrifying vibration that shook the air in the room. They saw the ancient seal yield to a woman their arrogant alpha discarded. And now, driven by the pathetic, greedy instinct of scavengers, they believe they can breach the caldera and harvest whatever power caused the anomaly. Saren looked down at the map. Her pale irises traced the jagged lines representing the impassable peaks surrounding the hidden caldera. She knew exactly how werewolf trackers operated. She had spent 5 years watching Julian dispatch them to hunt down rogues and enforce his brutal territorial treaties. They were relentless. Driven by the mental compulsion of the Alpha's pack link, they would throw their bodies against jagged glass if commanded to do so. They were hunting her. They believed she had stumbled upon a magical artifact, an ancient weapon that Julian could use to subjugate the neighboring realms and solidify Melissa Vance's stolen position as Luna. They still thought she was prey. "How many?" Saren asked quietly. 3 dozen, Zephyr replied. "They are attempting to scale the sheer obsidian cliffs directly above the eastern arch of the gate. The volcanic rock there is brittle, essentially vertical black glass, facing the great ashlands. They are tearing their own claws out, trying to find purchase, but the Alpha's compulsion drives them upward." The commander looked at Aurelius. "The inner guards are ready to intercept, my king. We can burn them off the outer perimeter before they reach the summit." "No." The word came from Saren. Both men turned to look at her. She did not shrink under the weight of their combined lethal presence. She stood tall, the radiant silk pooling around her bare feet, her expression entirely unreadable. She was no longer the broken woman who had fled the midwinter feast. The elixir of the sunken well had washed away the last traces of her subjugation. "They came for me," the woman stated. Her voice was devoid of emotion. It was a flat clinical truth. Julian sent them to watch me burn now. He is using his pack link to force them over a wall they cannot climb, hoping to drag me back in chains so he can strip me of whatever magic he thinks I found. She looked up, meeting Aurelius's burning amber gaze. I want to see them. Aurelius hesitated. It was not a hesitation born of defiance, but of a desperate, overwhelming instinct to shield her. He had spent centuries waiting for the return of his equal, and the thought of allowing the scent of her abusers anywhere near her pristine sanctuary made the beast beneath his armor thrash with violent intent. He wanted to keep her completely isolated from the cruelty of her past, wrapped safely in his mantle by the hearth. But he had sworn his life and his kingdom to her command. He would not cage her, even in gold. He released his crushing grip on the stone table. He bowed his head. As you wish, the sovereign rumbled. He extended his massive, scaled gauntlet. Saren placed her small, pale hand in his. The physical contrast was a stark reminder of the mythic power at her disposal. His fingers curled gently, encasing hers in a cocoon of impenetrable safety. Aurelius led her out of the hall. Zephyr fell into step silently behind them. They did not walk back toward the grand plazas of the hidden caldera. Instead, the king guided her toward a narrow, hidden archway carved directly into the living rock of the mountain's interior. The passage ascended sharply. It was a tactical stairwell, a vertical artery designed to transport the dragon lords to the highest defensive battlements overlooking the outer world. The climb was arduous. The air grew steadily thinner, carrying the crisp, biting chill of extreme altitude. The smooth marble of the royal wing gave way to rough, natural stone. Yet Saren did not falter. The magic of the elixir provided a limitless reservoir of stamina, and the immense radiating heat from the Titan walking beside her acted as a perfect, intimate shield against the dropping temperature. Every step she took was a deliberate severing of her past weakness. As they climbed higher, the pulsing crimson light of the alarm faded, replaced by the stark, blinding glare of the winter sun, slicing through narrow arrow slits in the rock. The werewolf pack link is a crude chain. Zephyr spoke quietly from behind, his voice echoing in the tight space. He was educating her, treating her not as a fragile rescued maiden, but as a sovereign observing her enemy's tactics. It forces the lesser wolves to absorb the alpha's greed. They are not climbing out of loyalty, Saren. They are climbing out of fear. I know, Saren replied, her gaze fixed on the ascending stone steps. Julian rules through the terror of isolation. If you do not serve, you are banished. If you are banished, you die. It is how he kept the entire pack on their knees. It is how he kept me silent. A brittle illusion, Aurelius murmured, his thumb brushing lightly over the knuckles of her hand. A king who rules through fear is merely a warden of a fragile prison. His walls are already crumbling. They reached the summit. A heavy iron door barred their path. Aurelius did not bother with the latch. He placed his free hand flat against the metal and pushed. The hinges shrieked in protest before snapping entirely, the massive door giving way to the sheer, devastating force of his casual movement. The heavy slab of iron crashed onto the stone outside. They stepped out onto the highest defensive battlements. It was a sprawling, semicircular parapet carved into the very peak of the mountain, suspended thousands of feet above the great dragon gate. The wind here was a physical blow, a howling gale that whipped Saren's dark hair around her face and snapped the heavy dark cape of the commander. But Aurelius shifted his massive frame, placing himself perfectly between her and the windward edge, breaking the freezing gale before it could touch her skin. Saren walked to the edge of the stone balustrade. She looked down. The view was staggering. Below, the great ashlands stretched out like a diseased, grey scar across the earth. The sky over the werewolf territories was bruised and dark, choked with the eternal drift of toxic snow. The absolute desolation of Julian's domain was a stark contrast to the blooming warmth at her back, and there, clinging to the sheer, obsidian cliffs bordering the great ashlands, were the trackers. They looked like desperate, grey insects scrabbling against a vertical wall of black glass. There were dozens of them, massive direwolves in their shifted forms, their fur matted with ash and frozen blood. They were leaping from jagged outcropping to precarious ledge, sliding backward, tearing their claws to the bone in a frantic bid to ascend. The sound of their panicked, aggressive snarling carried faintly on the updrafts mixing with the sickening scrape of bone on unforgiving volcanic rock. Saren stared at them. Only 3 days ago, a single one of these elite trackers would have made her blood run cold. They were Julian's enforcers, the same beasts that had stood in the banquet hall of the Pax fortress and laughed as her sacred mate bond was brutally severed. They had sneered as Melissa Vance paraded the stolen Silver Moon crest. They were the physical manifestation of the Alpha King's authority over her life and death. Now, looking down at them from the apex of the fated realms, she felt only a cold, clinical emptiness. There was no terror. There was no pity. The sheer, pathetic futility of their struggle was laid bare. They were throwing their lives away for a man who would replace them before their blood even dried on the rocks. The weak are but morsels for the merciless. The old warning echoed in her mind. Her mother had spoken it as a lament, a rule of survival for the weak in a pack society. But standing beside the Titan of the sky, surrounded by the unwavering devotion of the ancient realm, Saren finally understood the true nature of the world. She was no longer a small thing hiding in the shadows, waiting for permission to exist. The teeth belonged to her. "They are trying to find a fissure," Zephyr observed clinically, stepping to the edge beside her. A structural weakness in the cliff face to bypass the gate's incinerating magic. They are tracking the residual scent of the elixir on the wind. They believe if they breach the perimeter, they can carry you back as a prize. "They are staining my mountain with their blood," Aurelius rumbled. Saren turned her head to look at him. The king's amber eyes were fixed on the scrambling wolves below. The vertical slits of his pupils had swallowed the gold entirely, leaving 2 pools of endless, terrifying black. The restraint he maintained around her was slipping, peeling back to reveal the ancient, devastating monster that had once burned rival empires to ash. The blackened steel of his armor seemed to groan, struggling to contain the sheer, expanding mass of his fury. He was waiting. He was an apex predator, holding himself back by a single fraying thread of devotion, waiting for her explicit command. He would not act until she permitted it. He gave her the total choice that Julian Sterling had spent 5 years denying her. Saren looked back down at the wolves, desperately clawing at the outer perimeter. She thought of Julian Sterling, sitting comfortably in his warm keep, safely miles away, while he forced his pack to bleed on the glass. He believed he was untouchable. He believed he had won when he cast her into the freezing wasteland to die. "A name unspoken for 5 years grows teeth, my king." Julian was about to learn exactly whose name he had tried to erase from the annals of his pack. He was about to learn that he had not cast away a defective Omega, but awakened the last heir of the ancient sanctuary. Saren released Aurelius's hand. She stepped back, her bare feet silent on the cold stone, giving him the space he required to unleash the devastation he held entirely for her. "Clear the cliffs," the Queen commanded. It was not a shout. It was a quiet, absolute decree. Aurelius closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. A deep, shuddering breath expanded his massive chest. When he opened his eyes, the human guise was entirely gone. He stepped up onto the stone parapet. He did not look back. He did not hesitate. He simply stepped off the edge of the 1,000-foot drop. Saren rushed to the balustrade, gripping the cold stone. She watched the heavy, armored body of the sovereign plummet toward the grey abyss of the great ashlands. For 2 seconds, there was nothing but the howling wind. Then the sky caught fire. The transformation was a violent, magnificent biological eruption. It was not a puff of magical smoke or a subtle fading of forms. It was the raw, tectonic reshaping of anatomy. A blinding flash of liquid gold exploded in the open air, a shockwave of thermal energy that instantly vaporized the falling snow for a mile in every direction, turning the freezing atmosphere into a sudden, sweltering furnace. From the heart of the golden inferno, massive, impenetrable scales materialized. The dark plating melted directly into the creature's living hide. Bones elongated with the sound of grinding boulders. Two colossal, leathery wings snapped open, their span so impossibly wide they entirely eclipsed the pale winter sun, casting a massive, terrifying shadow over the entirety of the outer perimeter of the legendary barrier. The Golden Dragon King took flight. The sheer displacement of air from a single beat of his wings created a sudden hurricane. The updraft slammed against the mountain, rattling the stone beneath Saren's boots. The smell of ozone and burning iron flooded the thin atmosphere, overpowering the putrid scent of the toxic wastes. Down on the sheer obsidian cliffs, the werewolf trackers froze. The aggressive snarling ceased instantly. The frenzied compulsion of their alpha's link was shattered by the overwhelming, paralyzing terror of total biological supremacy. The massive direwolves clung to the sheer rock face, their ears pinned flat, their tails tucked between their legs. They stared up at the myth that had just blotted out the sky, realizing in one horrifying instant that they had not been tracking a helpless woman. They had been crawling into the maw of a sleeping god. Aurelius did not descend to fight them. Fighting implied a contest. Fighting implied they were worthy of his claws. This was an eradication. This was a statement. The colossal golden beast hovered in the air directly before the cliff face. His massive, horned head pulled back, the scales along his throat and chest illuminated from within, glowing with a brilliant, blinding heat that rivaled the core of a star. The air around him shimmered and warped with the intense thermal radiation. He did not unleash fire. Fire would have been a mercy. Fire would have ended their terror too quickly. Aurelius unleashed a roar. It was a concussive wave of pure, apocalyptic sound, a frequency so deep and devastating it bypassed the ears and struck directly at the internal organs. The shockwave hit the obsidian cliffs like a physical battering ram of solid air. The cliff face violently fractured. Millions of jagged shards of black volcanic glass exploded outward in a cloud of lethal shrapnel. The werewolf trackers were instantly blown off the mountain. They were scattered like dry leaves in a hurricane, sent tumbling backward into the freezing void of the great ashlands. The sheer force of the roar shattered their eardrums and crushed their equilibrium, sending them crashing down the jagged, ash-covered slopes in mindless panic. The primal, ancient magic behind the sound permanently severed the mental tethers, binding them to their brutal stronghold, leaving them completely isolated in their agonizing dread. Saren stood on the balcony, watching the devastation. The concussive wave washed over her, whipping her hair violently around her face, but Zephyr Thorn stood firm just behind her, his silver-scaled cape shielding her from the worst of the flying debris. She did not blink. She did not flinch. Her spine remained perfectly straight. The trackers who survived the massive fall were already fleeing, sprinting desperately back through the toxic snow toward the distant tree line of the werewolf territories. They abandoned their alpha's orders, abandoning their pack loyalty in a desperate bid for pure survival. They would carry the terror back to Julian Sterling. Through the shattered, bleeding remnants of the pack link, the Alpha King would feel the exact moment his elite forces encountered an unyielding force of nature. He would feel their broken bones. He would feel their shivering dread. He would realize that the woman he threw away was now protected by the most dangerous creature in the fated realms. Aurelius banked in the sky, his massive golden wings catching the soaring thermals. He circled back toward the mountain peak, a majestic, terrifying silhouette against the pale azure sky of the draconic realm. Zephyr Thorn stepped forward, his silver eyes fixed on the retreating specks vanishing into the ashlands. They will run all the way to the pack's walls. The Alpha will know his border is broken. He will know the stories of the sleeping kings are true. "Good," Saren said quietly. Her storm-pale eyes tracked the fleeing wolves until they completely disappeared into the toxic grey smoke of the wastes. Let him feel the cold. Let him wonder what is coming for him in the dark when the snow begins to fall. The colossal beast descended, his massive talons gripping the stone of the lower battlements with earth-shaking force. The golden light flared again, blindingly bright, wrapping around his colossal form. When the light faded, the titan of a man stood in the courtyard below, his dark armor steaming in the freezing high-altitude air. He looked up at the highest defensive battlements. He looked up at her, entirely submissive to her gaze, despite the ruin he had just unleashed upon the earth. Saren met his burning amber gaze, the fracture in her soul, bleeding for 5 long years under the cruelty of Julian and Melissa, was permanently sealed. The frightened, mute Omega, who had desperately tried to survive the freezing winters, was dead. She turned away from the edge of the world, her shimmering golden gown sweeping gracefully over the cold stone. It was time to reclaim her stolen crown, and this time she would not be begging for a place in the pack. She would be marching with a legion of dragons at her back. The sky above the great ashlands did not simply change color, it was violently conquered. For 5 centuries, the airspace between the frozen werewolf territories and the impassable mountain peaks had been a desolate, toxic void. Now it was a river of living fire. A massive armada of golden dragons moved through the heavy winter clouds, their colossal wings beating in a synchronized, earth-shattering rhythm that drove the toxic grey smoke down into the dirt. At the vanguard of the legion, the draconic warlord led the march. In his mythic, shifted form, Aurelius was a landscape of impenetrable golden scales and lethal, streamlined muscle. His wingspan eclipsed the pale sun, casting a sprawling, magnificent shadow over the jagged, volcanic rock below, and positioned safely in the deep, protective curve where his massive neck met his armored shoulders, Saren Voss rode. She was not lashed to the beast with leather harnesses or crude iron chains. The ancient magic of the elixir of the sunken well, now fully awake in her bloodstream, anchored her effortlessly to the sovereign. A perfect shield of thermal energy wrapped around her, blocking the freezing, high-altitude wind and the residual bite of the toxic ash. Beneath her hands, the king's golden scales were smooth and radiantly warm, humming with the deep, resonant frequency of his heartbeat. She looked down at the world blurring past. Below them, the jagged, volcanic obsidian gave way to a vast expanse of intermediate pine forests. The dragon armada cast a sprawling, undulating shadow across the ancient canopy, a terrifying eclipse that silenced the woodland creatures and sent the lesser predators scattering into their dens. It had taken her 2 agonizing days to cross the outer wastes on foot, bleeding and freezing, driven solely by the stubborn refusal to die. From the sky, the journey took less than an hour. The geography that had nearly claimed her life was rendered insignificant. Behind them, Zephyr Thorn and hundreds of dragon warriors maintained a flawless, silent formation. They did not roar. They did not need to broadcast their arrival with chaotic, animalistic noise. The sheer atmospheric pressure of their collective presence was enough to silence the entire realm. As the dense forests gave way to the ancient, snow-heavy pines of the werewolf territory, the temperature of the air began to drastically shift. The winter was breaking. Down in the center of the forested lands, the Red-Tooth Keep sat like a dark, rotting tooth against the white landscape. The fortress was in a state of frantic chaos. The surviving border trackers had returned hours ago, their minds shattered, their pack links violently severed by the roar at the mountain. The outer courtyard was swarming with panicked guards, heavily armed wolves pacing nervously behind the thick iron portcullises. Saren stared at the approaching stone towers, the place where she had spent 5 years being told she was nothing. The place where she had stood in a silver dress and listened to the man she loved publicly strip away her dignity. Her pulse remained steady. The frightened, mute Omega, who would have trembled at the sight of those walls, was gone, washed away in the sunken well. Aurelius banked sharply, his massive body angling downward toward the heart of the keep. The armada followed, a descending storm of gold and ozone. The invasion did not begin with a siege. It began with the complete obliteration of the pack's environment. As the Legion breached the low cloud cover, directly above the fortress, the ambient temperature of the courtyard skyrocketed. The freezing winter air was instantly superheated. The thick layers of snow blanketing the parapets and the cobblestones did not just melt. They flashed immediately into thick, blinding white steam. The heavy icicles hanging from the defensive battlements shattered, raining down like dull glass. The warning bells of the keep began to ring. It was a frantic, chaotic clanging that sounded entirely pathetic against the deep, rhythmic thrum of massive wings. Aurelius did not target the outer walls. He folded his colossal wings and dropped like a meteor directly into the central training yard. The impact was catastrophic. The Sovereign hit the ground with the force of a massive earthquake. The ancient, interlocking cobblestones exploded outward in a shockwave of shattered rock and boiling mud. The heavy iron weapon racks lining the yard were flattened instantly, twisted into unrecognizable scrap metal. The concussive force of his landing threw 24 shifted direwolves backward, sending them crashing into the stone walls of the armory. The king raised his massive horned head and exhaled a long, pluming breath of superheated vapor. He did not roar. The stifling silence of the beast was infinitely worse. Above him, the commander and the vanguard descended. Hundreds of dragons landed seamlessly on the high towers, the defensive walls, and the surrounding cliffs. Their massive talons crushed the stone parapets. They folded their wings and simply looked down, their glowing, reptilian eyes locking onto the cowering werewolves below. The fortress was entirely surrounded, trapped in a cage of mythic supremacy. In the center of the ruined courtyard, Aurelius lowered his massive shoulder. Saren slid down, her bare feet touching the steaming, broken stones. She was dressed in the gown of shimmering golden silk, the heavy, dark mantle with its golden fur draped elegantly over her shoulders. She stood tall, her spine perfectly straight, her metallic gaze sweeping over the terrified faces of the pack. A blinding flash of golden light erupted behind her. The sheer thermal displacement forced the nearest wolves to shield their eyes. When the light faded, the colossal dragon was gone. Aurelius Drake stood at her side in his human guise. He was encased in his midnight armor, a towering, terrifying titan of war. He did not step in front of her to fight her battles. He stepped half a pace behind her right shoulder, cementing his position as her unyielding shield. The silence in the courtyard was suffocating. The only sounds were the hiss of melting snow and the terrified, shallow panting of the shifted wolves, whose bellies were pressed flat against the mud by the sheer gravitational weight of the dragon lords. Then, the heavy oak doors of the main keep violently swung open. Julian Sterling stepped out onto the raised stone dais. The Alpha King was flanked by his elite guard, though the warriors were visibly trembling, their hands shaking so badly their swords rattled against their scabbards. The ruler wore his crown of iron and his heavy cloak of black direwolf fur. His storm-grey eyes were wide, darting frantically from the massive dragons perched on his walls to the Titan standing in his courtyard. And then his gaze locked onto the woman in the center of the destruction. Julian stopped walking, the breath hitched in his chest, a sharp, audible gasp that carried through the suffocating silence. He recognized her face, but absolutely nothing else about her was the same. The pale, exhausted girl he had banished into the outer wastes was gone. In her place stood an empress. The golden silk caught the light of the burning sky, making her look like a deity descended to judge the dirt. The scent of her, once a faint muted thing heavily masked by his own overpowering pack magic, was now an ancient, thrumming force of nature. It smelled of blooming hearths, crushed pine, and ozone. Most importantly, it was completely free of his claim. The metaphysical void where his mate bond had once connected to her soul was gone. She was completely untethered from him. Behind the former mate, a second figure emerged from the keep. Melissa Vance faltered the moment she stepped onto the dais. The usurper was dressed in a heavy velvet gown, the silver moon crest hanging prominently against her chest. But the moment she saw the legion of dragons, the smug, calculated predator facade shattered, her face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. The cloying scent of her poisoned honey perfume was instantly incinerated by the heavy, ozone-rich air of the dragon vanguard. She shrank back, hiding behind the Alpha's broad shoulders, her hands clutching the silver necklace, as if the cold metal could somehow protect her from a myth made manifest. "Saren," the man breathed. The words slipped out of his mouth, devoid of any regal authority. It was a hoarse, ragged sound of disbelief. The Queen did not move. She looked at her former abuser with a cold, clinical detachment. 3 days ago, standing on the dais inside, his rejection had felt like a bone piercing her lungs. She had looked at him and seen the center of her universe collapsing. Now, looking up at him on those same steps, she saw exactly what the Titan had called him, a boy playing with shadows in a mud pit. His iron crown looked cheap. His direwolf fur looked heavy and suffocating. He was a small, cruel man who ruled through fear, and his entire world was currently kneeling in the dirt. "You are trespassing on pack land." Julian forced the words out, desperately trying to project the command that had controlled his people for 5 generations. He puffed his chest out, trying to look imposing against the armored sovereign standing behind the golden silk. "I do not know what dark magic you found in the wastes, but you will order these beasts to withdraw." A low, dark rumble vibrated from the blackened steel. The sound was so deep it rattled the broken cobblestones beneath their feet. The mythic ruler's amber eyes flared with a lethal, blinding light. The air around the Titan began to warp with a sudden, intense spike in thermal pressure. He took a single, half-step forward, his scaled gauntlet twitching toward the hilt of the massive broadsword sheathed at his hip. Saren raised her right hand. Just an inch. Aurelius stopped instantly. The terrifying apex predator froze mid-stride, reining in his devastating fury simply because she asked it of him. He remained perfectly still, a loaded weapon waiting for her explicit command. The display of unconditional, voluntary submission from a creature capable of leveling the fortress sent a fresh wave of terror through the werewolf ranks. The Alpha's jaw went slack. The local king, who demanded blind obedience through violence and intimidation, could not comprehend the level of raw devotion the towering monarch had just displayed for a discarded Omega. "I order nothing to withdraw," Saren stated. Her voice was not loud, but it carried perfectly across the ruined courtyard, resonating with the strange, ancient acoustics of her awakened bloodline. 3 days ago, you stood before 300 people and declared that I had no power to defend this pack. You stated that the moon was blind to the realities of war. You stripped me of my dignity, handed my place to a woman whose loyalty is as artificial as her scent, and sent me into the ashlands to die. Julian swallowed hard, his hands opened and closed at his sides. The arrogance that usually shielded him was rapidly eroding under the crushing weight of the dragon lords watching from the battlements. The border trackers. The trembling man stammered, his eyes darting to the eastern wall. They reported an anomaly, a breach in the ancient seal. I didn't know. I couldn't have known you were. You couldn't have known I was a dragon hare, Saren finished for him, her silver-grey eyes cutting right through his pathetic defense. Because you were too blind to look past your own ego. You wanted a weapon you could control. You wanted a wolf who would cower and submit. I was never meant to submit to the dirt. She took a slow, deliberate step forward. Her bare feet moved gracefully over the steaming mud and broken stone. The great dragon gate did not burn me. It welcomed me. It awoke the true sovereign of this realm, and he did not look at me and see a defective, magicless runt. The woman paused, her gaze shifting briefly to Aurelius. The king's amber eyes were fixed entirely on her, softening with a profound, breathless reverence that made her chest tighten with genuine warmth. She looked back at the Alpha. He knelt. The words struck Julian like physical blows. The broken ruler staggered back half a step, hitting the heavy oak door behind him. The pack elders, including the sycophantic advisor who had once mocked her silence, were huddled in the corners of the courtyard. Their faces were buried in the mud, too terrified to even look upon the golden empress they had mercilessly discarded. "Please," the former mate's voice cracked, the facade of the king completely shattered. Panic, raw and unfiltered, bled into his tone. He took a step down the stairs, his hands reaching out toward her in a desperate, pleading gesture. The fated bond. It was a mistake. The pack elders pressured me. Melissa manipulated the court. I can fix this. I can sever her claim right now. I will execute her for treason against the true Luna. Behind him, the usurper let out a sharp, terrified shriek. She scrambled backward, tripping over the hem of her heavy velvet gown, abandoning her Alpha as she tried to crawl back into the dark corridors of the keep. Saren watched the betrayal unfold with zero surprise. It was pathetic. It was the frantic flailing of a coward who realized he was standing on the tracks of an approaching train. "You cannot fix what is already dead," the Empress said softly. "The fracture in my soul is sealed. The elixir of the sunken well burned your weak, toxic magic from my veins. I do not feel you anymore. When I look at you, I feel absolutely nothing." Julian dropped to his knees. It was not a bow of reverence. It was a collapse of pure, agonizing despair. The realization hit him with the force of a falling mountain. He had held the most powerful, ancient bloodline in the fated realms in his hands, and he had thrown it into the fire for a cheap imitation. He wept. Tears of bitter, blinding regret spilled down his cheeks as he stared at the pristine, glowing skin of the woman he had destroyed. He wept for the power he had lost. He wept for the ruin he had brought upon his pack. Saren did not blink. She did not feel the urge to mock him, nor did she feel the urge to offer him forgiveness. Some betrayals were a permanent severing of reality. She turned her back on him. Her gaze swept over the terrified werewolves pressed into the mud of the courtyard. The Red Tooth Pack is no longer an independent sovereign state. You are a vassal territory to the Dragon Kingdom. Your borders belong to the dragons. Your treaties are null and void. If a single wolf crosses the tree line into the high mountains, your keep will not be spared the fire a second time. No one argued. No one challenged her. The crushing silence of the pack was their formal surrender. Saren walked back to where Aurelius stood. The Titan looked down at her, his amber eyes scanning her face to ensure the confrontation had not caused her any lingering distress. Finding only calm, resolute certainty in her silver-grey gaze, the sovereign let out a soft, rumbling exhale. "Are we finished here, my queen?" he asked quietly, completely ignoring the weeping man on the stone steps behind them. "We are," she replied. Aurelius offered his arm. The woman placed her hand gently against his armored forearm. The king did not shift back into his colossal beast form. Instead, he simply raised his free hand. On the battlements above, the commander and the vanguard unleashed a synchronized, deafening roar. It was a sound of absolute victory, a concussive blast of sheer, mythic power that shattered the remaining glass in the keep's windows and forced the humiliated Alpha to curl into a miserable, shivering ball on the stones. The armada took to the sky, their massive wings blotting out the sun one final time before banking toward the east. Aurelius swept his heavy, dark mantle around Saren's shoulders, shielding her entirely from the swirling ash and debris. In a flash of blinding golden light and thermal pressure, they vanished from the ruined courtyard. The werewolf keep was left in absolute, shivering silence. The winter slowly began to creep back into the superheated stone, but the warmth of the true Luna would never return. Hours later, the sky above the dragon's sanctuary was painted in rich, bleeding hues of violet and deep orange as the sun sank below the impassable peaks. The air in the chamber of the first queens was thick with the scent of crushed pine and blooming night jasmine. The massive hearth crackled steadily, casting a warm, flickering light over the plush rugs and shimmering linens. The distant, soothing sound of the bioluminescent waterfalls echoed softly through the open, arched windows. Saren stood on the sweeping stone balcony, looking out over the peaceful, glowing city. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a profound, settling peace. The heavy weight of the past 5 years had been surgically removed from her shoulders. She was no longer bracing for an attack. She was no longer making herself small to avoid the cruel gaze of a Sessa man. She heard the quiet, deliberate footfalls behind her. Aurelius stepped onto the balcony. He had removed his heavy armor. He wore a simple, loose linen shirt that hung open at the collar, revealing the thick, corded muscles of his chest and the faint, glowing veins of ancient magic that pulsed beneath his dark skin. He moved with the slow, languid grace of a predator that finally felt safe in its own territory. He stopped just behind her, ensuring he did not crowd her space. The scouts report that the former king has locked himself in the lower dungeons of the keep. The Titan murmured, his deep voice vibrating pleasantly against the quiet evening air. The pack elders are already turning on him. The alliance is broken. They will spend the next decade fighting over the scraps of a ruined crown. "Let them," the Empress said softly, not turning away from the view of the setting sun. "It is a world of teeth. They can eat each other." Aurelius let out a low, rough chuckle. He stepped closer, the immense, radiant warmth of his body acting as a perfect shield against the cooling evening breeze. "And what of the Queen?" he asked, his tone dropping to a fierce, devoted whisper. "What does she require?" Saren turned to face him. The Titan of a man looked down at her. His burning amber eyes were completely stripped of the terrifying apex predator that had crushed the werewolf defenses. He looked at her with the same profound, breathless awe he had shown when he first knelt in the dark tunnel. He was a creature of world-ending destruction, yet he held his hands carefully behind his back, waiting for her explicit invitation. Not a pawn, not a possession, a partner. Saren reached out. Her small, pale hand slid up the solid, warm expanse of his chest, her fingers curling gently into the fabric of his linen shirt. The physical contact sent a deep, resonating hum of golden magic through her veins. It was the ultimate, sensory relief of safe, gentle physical touch after years of freezing isolation. Aurelius closed his eyes. A ragged, heavy sigh escaped his lips. He leaned down, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He wrapped his massive arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his solid frame. The embrace was entirely devoid of aggressive dominance. It was the desperate, anchoring hold of a man who had finally found his home after centuries in the dark. Saren rested her cheek against his chest, listening to the slow, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the golden valley sink into her bones. The winter was over. The true queen had awakened. The ancient keep of the Red-Tooth Werewolf pack still stands at the frozen edge of the Ashlands, slowly crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. They say, on the coldest, quietest nights, the broken Alpha still paces the lower dungeons, endlessly haunted by the memory of a golden light he was too blind to understand. If you believe that true worth can never be buried in the ash, and that the right protector will gladly burn the world to keep you safe, please take a moment to like and subscribe to our sanctuary. Join our circle of listeners and never miss the next tale of quiet survival, deep comfort, and sweet vindication.